Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Startup Genome Global Webinar for today. For today's topic, we will be focusing on multiplying ecosystem growth and policy impact, a data-driven assessment and prioritization of gaps to build your ecosystem strategy. So moving into today's agenda, we will be going through why is this topic important and especially why now. Then we will be going through our Startup Genome's way of multiplying ecosystem growth and policy impact. We'll be going through our global peer learning and membership and hearing what is the impact. And today we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Thomas Funke join us from Frankfurt, Germany, our member in Frankfurt from TechQuartier. And then we'll finish off with some open questions and answers. So moving to the purpose of our Startup Genome Global Webinar Series, it's about highlighting specific tangible topics for startup ecosystem acceleration in order to produce sustainable ecosystem growth globally. In these sessions, we explain how we at Startup Genome support global startup ecosystems, as well as how our partners do. And as always, we always are wanting to hear your feedback, hear from you of what more topics that you would like to hear about. So previous topics that we have had include funding policy to support startups and scale-ups, where we had Josh Lerner, Harvard Business School, who's a global expert in this field, as well as attracting the best talent and international resources. So globally positioning your ecosystem and more. You can rewatch all of our webinars on our Startup Genome YouTube channel there. And for future, our next upcoming webinar will be on September 9th, which is how we are supporting the global startup revolution. And as always, we have our 8 a.m. London and 8 a.m. San Francisco time to accommodate all time zones. And a note is that everyone will receive the recordings of these webinars who's joining, as well as the slides. So you'll have all the links there. So for today's webinar, as I mentioned, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Thomas Funke, the Managing Director at TechQuartier, join us today, who is our member in Frankfurt, Germany, as well as Stephan, Kuester, our Head of Ecosystem Strategy here at Startup Genome. So without further ado, I would like to pass it over to our Head of Ecosystem Strategy, Stephan Kuester.
Very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Delighted to have you here today with us at the Startup Genome webcast here out of London. The global startup ecosystem revolution, why is this also important? Adam made the point in our introduction. In our measurement, the current startup ecosystem globally is valued at about 2.8 trillion net exit values and valuations. When you think about that, that's the size of a G7 economy. And when we look at growth rates, that the startup ecosystem economy in a number of years will be the second or third largest industry sector in the world if growth continues, as we all hope it might. So from that perspective, great news. Our startup economy is already an enormous economic factor. Based here in London, in the UK, the impact of the startup segment alone on GDP is 10% nationwide, not London only, nationwide, and employment terms up to 9%. So it is really a very significant factor. That's why, from a policymaker perspective, from a general economics perspective, the startup ecosystem development has become so incredibly important for most countries. That's the positive news. The not so good news is since we track since January the development of startup ecosystems and our entrepreneurs all around the world to ascertain the impact of the COVID challenge. And what you can see on the slide is impact of the crisis on revenue. And it's maybe not a surprise, but it's dire news to say there are about 50% of companies that have been affected, losing 20%, 21% or more of their revenue, some down completely, losing about 8%, completely losing their revenue base. That's not funding, that's revenue. So that's really the business they create. That's obviously a major concern because it is a threat we all have done jointly with a lot of resource, a lot of investment, a lot of taxpayers dollars in support, and a lot of sweat and commitment, and that's where we are today. So these are current data. When you think about funding data post-crisis or during the crisis, it is about 60% of companies that have less than 6 months of runway. There are 10% who are basically out of money already, and there's a good chunk, a third, that have 3 or less month of financial runway. So they are in what we would call the danger zone, the red zone of going extinct just because of running out of cash flow. So the combination of eroded revenue base, customers not buying, plus term sheets being derailed, being investments, follow-on investments being slowed down by the investors, although already committed in many cases, has a major impact. That's something we need to be absolutely aware of. So we need to act in order to solidify and in order to stabilize what's happening here. Why do we need to act now? We are showing here a number of data from the last financial crisis, 09-10, global financial crisis. And computer systems design technology as a whole was really the growth driver during and past the last global recession. I personally have witnessed the financial crisis in London, in the financial part of the city of London. And it has been incredible to see the impact on traditional finance organizations of that last crisis, but also how the technology segment and the startup segment that started to bloom right in the crisis has really allowed the city to come out of that crisis and to counteract the recession that we're hitting in 2010 and 11. So that's really from our perspective, and we hear it from many government leaders in the world, betting on the startup, the tech, the creative industries in order to get us out of what undoubtedly will be a post-COVID, post-pandemic economic crisis. And we strongly believe, now our data and indicators are confirming this, the startup segment is going to be one of these critical drivers. That's why we are so adamant about support it now and make sure entrepreneurs have enough financial runway, have enough revenue opportunity in order to stabilize their businesses, so we don't lose a generation or two. To make the point even more strongly, here we try to understand how economic development has worked in the past, and what's the role of R&D, research and development, academic research. And traditionally, it undoubtedly, tech geographies like Seoul, South Korea, or Taiwan, Taipei, in the early 2000s were leading the world in tech, in economic impact by tech, coming out of traditional research, traditional academic IP production, patent production, and then being used by larger corporations. That picture has fundamentally changed. When you look today, the really successful ecosystems or economies in tech are Silicon Valley, undoubtedly, no surprise. Toronto, Waterloo, the former old-fashioned industrial triangle that today is a hotbed of university innovation, but also startup innovation. Vancouver, very similar. When you look at the former champions, Seoul, Taiwan, and Taipei, they've really fallen behind. And what's lacking here, the research hasn't changed, the academic prowess has not changed, the IP production, patent production has not changed. But what these cities are lacking, and they're very conscious of it, we are working with both their city mayors in both Seoul and Taipei at the moment, is really the ability to use their academic prowess, their academic innovation very quickly in order to bring new ideas into market. And startup segments have proven to be that mechanism that very quickly can pick up on an idea in a university lab and try to commercialize the idea and make a real economic success out of it. We find these data enormously striking. They tell the story about a new economic development dynamic, stating don't invest only into traditional R&D and universities. That's still a good thing, undoubtedly. But at the same time, if you want to see economic impact, if you want to see high quality job creation, you need a vibrant startup segment around the universities in order to commercialize much more quicker. We call it ambidextrous innovation ecosystems that undoubtedly are performing best. So that's really the important part of that story. Last but not least, I was talking about COVID and economic. We've calculated at Genome the cost of saving a job in this crisis in the traditional SME versus a startup, and our findings are quite staggering. It costs, from our perspective and our data, 40% less if you as a government, as a policymaker, seek to save a job in a startup, Series A funded startup, as opposed to a traditional SME. We've calculated that over a number of years. So the the really important point when you think about job preservation, think about your startup ecosystems. Even if they are smaller than traditional SME employment, the impact, the lever you've got is so much larger. That's really important to take home. When you consider all these arguments, that's the argument we are trying to make. Keep the startup ecosystem environment, the segment in the focus of your attention, even if you get distracted by the impact of COVID, by the impact of the upcoming recession, etc. I think we can make a very solid point, and please use our data in internal discussions in government and elsewhere to really make it clear that the startup segment is an important part of economic recovery. There's no doubt. We today, in terms of participation in the global startup ecosystem revolution, these data are pre-COVID, but they haven't changed much. It is an incredibly positive story. The startup ecosystem is incredibly impactful, as I've thought to demonstrate. But when you look at economic value, at the moment, we are still in a phase where about 70% of economic value is tied to a very small number of cities in the world. So we are not yet seeing this broader participation of more and more startup ecosystems in the high value creation that the startup segment brings. That's obviously something, it's our purpose, our mission as a company, to break this concentration and to entice more and more smaller cities, smaller clusters to participate and to make a success out of their participation. That's what we want to talk about today. How do I actually do it? What do I need to understand? And how do I participate to a much larger extent in this very problem? Today, we want to talk about very practical things. Ecosystem assessments. How do I understand how my ecosystem is doing? Can I do that from a very, that's what we pride ourselves in, from a very objective perspective? Can I see what is happening in my environment? Where should I, as a policymaker, as an ecosystem leader, privately or publicly, where should I look? Where should I seek to help most effectively? And what are the right measures at the right point in time? These questions we try to analyze, and we try to do it with what we believe is truly our world-leading quantitative database about startup ecosystem developments, our data science around cluster development, and about 100+ metrics that we can use in order to really understand what's happening in the ecosystem, how is it performing, and where should you, as leaders in your ecosystem, act next in order to make it even better and accelerate your development. Second point, ecosystem strategy and action roadmap development. We want to very briefly talk about what do I do with all these learnings? If I've done an assessment, I've understood the dynamics of my ecosystem. How do I really get to, I always call it like the orchestra playing very well, an orchestrated roadmap along which I can predictably and repeatably improve the performance of my ecosystem, accelerate and development. That's what we want to showcase to you today with a number of examples. And I'm so delighted to have Thomas with us today, because he's one of these great examples where somebody has started with a deep understanding of what's happening in his ecosystem in Frankfurt, and then developed an incredibly positive and incredibly effective strategy and roadmap, and is now reaping the fruits of that work, which was incredibly condensed and fast from our perspective. When we talk about ecosystem development, the model I was alluding to, let me very briefly describe that. On the left-hand side, we believe that entrepreneurial activity is obviously the essence of what we are doing, but there's about the ecosystem resource, the regional assets, the support mechanisms, the university clusters, etc. They are all resources entrepreneurs work with. We can codify how well they are performing and which impact they have on entrepreneurial activities. So that's layer one on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we are showing what we would call in our model the multipliers, and that's nothing but the quality of community. Local connectedness is the quality of your local community. How well are founders supporting other founders? Are they giving back to their community? Are they supporting others who are developing their footsteps? How open are investors, angels and others? How open are technical experts from corporations or from universities in helping young founders to succeed and answer their questions? That's all quality of community, and we try to codify that in a term and a scientific measure that's called local connectedness. The same global connectedness, the multiplier as an ecosystem. How well are you connected to other large startup ecosystems and this global fabric of startup knowledge, of technology and business knowledge? But also how well are you connected in terms of having relationships that in the end lead to an export-focused business. As an entrepreneur, can I tap into New York, London, Singapore, and elsewhere in order to really and quickly tap a global market? Combine all of these together and you get economic impact. And we believe that there are a number of public policy and private policy drivers that can be used to accelerate entrepreneurial activity, regional assets, ecosystem resources, but also quality of community. That's what we want to talk about. First, from the assessment perspective. Secondly, from actually get there. Speaking positively. Speaking negatively, what we've seen, and we're currently working with about 35 governments in more than 75 cities, from very experienced, very mature ecosystems to very young and nascent ones. The biggest barriers to good policy action when it comes to improving and accelerating startup ecosystem development can maybe be codified in these 4 points. Confusion, there's some misalignment in the community, in the local community. In the community, we don't only mean entrepreneurs, we mean all the stakeholders that are participating in the ecosystem on what to do and what to do next. Different thoughts, different ideas and concepts, not necessarily always the right ones. Dispersion, we see a lot of people traveling a lot. They come to London and Silicon Valley and they see a lot of shiny things and try to bring them home. And then they wonder why they spread their budgets, but also their personal resource very thinly, too many priorities. In the end, you don't get any action or any meaningful action and visible action. That seems to be a very common problem that we see, inspired by many delegations, really coming home with lots of, as I put it, shiny things they seek to implement. Timing plays a role. I will introduce an ecosystem model in a moment, which basically codifies the right norm strategies, as I would call it, that are right at a certain stage of development of an ecosystem. What works in Silicon Valley doesn't work in Palestine. It's very obvious. They're in very different stages of development, and we need to find the right set of actions at the right point in time. That's why we've developed a proprietary ecosystem model that allows you to get timing better. Not always perfect, but certainly much better. Last but not least, commitment to little investment to really move the needle. We see that sometimes that policymakers look at startup competitions and celebrations and a little bit of PR and believe they've really done the work. That's certainly not the case. Ecosystem development is hard. It is not super costly, but it is resource intensive. And it's a 5 to 10 year game as opposed to a 1 or 2 year game with light budget and light commitment only. We get to good innovation policy impact, understanding where we are. We've been talking about that. Assessment and benchmark. Assessment is always nice. You get a bunch of data, but to make them meaningful, what does it really mean to have a certain level of funding, a certain level of talent, a certain level of lab to startup performance? And I'll explain the term in a moment. Is that good or bad? That's always the problem to ascertain. So the benchmarking, from our perspective, becomes incredibly important. Can I benchmark myself? Not against Silicon Valley or London if I'm sitting in a nascent, in a young ecosystem, but against peers who've been there 1 or 2 years before me. Can I learn from that benchmark? And our answer is yes, we provide these data. I want to help you use benchmarks to really understand where are your factor gaps, how far is the distance to frontier, to best practice, and give you really a yardstick to see how far you have to develop in order to catch up or even accelerate beyond the best in class. Identifying innovation edge. We want to talk a little bit about the notion that I already mentioned. Activating universities, activating intellectual property, and using the startup ecosystem, these ambidextrous startup ecosystems, as we seek to term them, in order to much more quickly use innovation and bring it to market, and make commercial use out of it, not citations, but commercial use. Learning from experts, peers about successes. That's easy. Everybody talks about them, and there's a lot written about them, but also about policy failures. And Adam later on will introduce our network, which prides itself as a private forum, a very broad, very international forum that talks more about policy failures as opposed to successes, because the learning in the end is about the things that didn't work. These are the ones we share amongst each other. Last but not least, can we define action plans and execute them properly in order to have maximum impact? And I want to show a few of those. I mentioned our ecosystem development model, 4 phases from activation to integration. You can see it here in the materials. The slide is to say for each of these phases is a set of strategies that we have found out based on our data analysis, our data science of the last 10 years, that seem to work and that seem to create the right impact. They're not cookie cutter, they're not all exactly the same, but directionally 50–60% of our recommendations always relate to the ecosystem lifecycle model at a particular phase. What works in integration is New York, London. That certainly does not work in activation. There's no point in applying and leveraging these policies from the large ecosystems if you are in a different phase. Also important to note, every phase, when developed successfully, takes about 2 to 3 years. And the levers, the strategies, the ideas, the concepts really fundamentally change. So from activation to globalization, the ecosystem grows. Globalization for us is defined as 1,000 startups in an ecosystem. Your focus, your strategy, your direction fundamentally changes. It's these points which we need to capture in order to really align strategies, investment, etc. So using the wrong strategies at the wrong point in time is utter waste and a lot of taxpayers' money misdirected, and we really want to make that very clear. I want to show you a number of other benchmarking capabilities, a number of other data. Here we are looking at an ecosystem that's not missing the foundation, but it's missing, well, it has a few lacks in its foundation, but it is very clearly missing the top of an ecosystem funnel of a pyramid. It's not producing the scale-ups, these shiny lighthouses that inspire other entrepreneurs to follow. And when it comes to data and benchmarking capability, we can very exactly quantify what an ecosystem, that's the current ecosystem. It's one of our clients who we don't want to name. They produce out of 100 startups in startup output startups they created, 8% that get seed stage funding, which seems not great, but it's not so far off. The global average is 30% better. In Series A, 1.9%. That's 70% less than their peers in the same life cycle phase. Yeah. Then you go up 100 million plus valuation scale-ups, 0.13%. That's 86% worse than their peers. Not London, Singapore, or Silicon Valley, their peers. Globalization phase ecosystem, that's what we are looking at here. To make that very clear and show the frontier to best performance, there's a long way to go, and the way is particularly long and hard to go when it comes to the top of the pyramid. But in the end, this ecosystem will not grow from globalization to the next phase, integration, if it is not capable of fixing this top end, the scale-up segment that has proven so important for our peer benchmarking. I think it allows to really quantify what is happening in that ecosystem. In regards to the quality of community, local connectedness, benchmark data that tell us that an entrepreneur starting an ecosystem that has a high quality community is growing 2.1 times faster than somebody who is working in a more isolated community. Nothing else changes. Same quality, same funding of the entrepreneur, same funding. Everything else is the same. The quality of local connectedness, local community is an uplift of 2.1, so twice as fast. There we go. Community a little bit more in detail. What are we trying to ascertain? Founder relationships on the left-hand side. That's nothing but founders helping other founders. Entrepreneur talks to entrepreneur and gives tips, tricks, and shares insight. The same we measure for investor relationships. Are there angels, are there VCs who are giving their time for free without any equity in order to help an entrepreneur with questions? Is that the case or not? And the ecosystem we are looking at here, founder to founder, seems all right. It's about nearly at global average. When it comes to investor relationships, these angels, these VCs are not really talking to their founders as they should. There's a significant gap, and the same applies, not as bad, but certainly significant enough, to what we call expert relationships, shown on the right-hand side. Expert relationships, that's an engineer in a corporation, that's a tax specialist, a lawyer advising on a piece of regulation, and just giving a bit of insight for free without expecting direct payment or equity. That's the kind of conversation we try to have in order to ascertain community, local community, quality of local community. Points towards what can be done in order to improve, let's say, investor relationships. Can I build better forums where angel groups, angels and angel syndicates meet with the startup ecosystem in order to drive this up? I'm showing here. These are the conversations we try to trigger with the assessments. Global connectedness, same thing. If a founder is well connected to this network of knowledge that has been created in the more mature ecosystems, they will grow at about 2.5 times faster. Nothing else changes. Same quality of entrepreneur, same funding, just better connected Connected means more knowledge, but it also means more market reach, more ability to compete internationally and to sell. The uplift is 2.5. Just keep that in mind, how important it is. Here we've measured our clients' ecosystem, and if I would point to one thing, it is certainly global connectedness that's not working. So they are good in their domestic market, and the community is all right, funding is all right, etc. But they are really not connecting to the international markets. And our client here is about a 25 million population, so it's not a massive market. Their founders really need to step up. They really need to sell regionally and internationally if they are to succeed in building a scale-up segment. It's very clear. Really transcend through. If you're not connected globally, you are selling less internationally. And we even ask for mindset of founders. They don't even have the mindset in this particular case to say, I want to crack an international market. Targeting global markets first, not really a priority for most founders in that ecosystem. Fundamentally wrong approach also from a cultural perspective. That's what we try to really bring to bear and to make very obvious with the analysis. Summary here, I've been talking about it, but that's basically trying to go through the different cultural and community factors and understand in order to understand how community locally and internationally works. Funding, important element. We try to do a very detailed funding analysis all the way from the very foundations, percent of seed funded startups in the early stages and the survival rates. That's part of the analysis. Median amounts, median funding runway for companies in the middle, and then in the end, how much money is there available for the larger routes as well, to really understand the different phases, pre-seed, seed, Series A, and onward scaling finance. Again, just to show a few examples, again, that's the client's ecosystem here. Seed median round size seems very small. Issue, but we were also conscious about very different wage levels. The place here is very much cheaper in terms of engineering talent as opposed to a London, if I take my home example, and we normalize that. And all of a sudden you see that ecosystem doesn't look too bad. That's the number of engineers funded by a median seed round. It's absolutely competitive. This ecosystem is above globalization average. So it's doing well. It's funded significantly. The seed funding available is absolutely fine. This is not the problem that's holding the ecosystem back. I guess I was talking about global connectedness so much. That's much more where the problem lies. It is not funding in this particular, not seed stage funding. As having said, we look at funding because it is so important always as a complete funding policy. Pre-seed, seed, Series A, and onward finance, scaling finance. Really try to shape the right mechanisms here in order to make sure that. We are also very adamant believers in the use of private initiative and private money. So the example shown or discussed here is all about angels and angel syndicates. Seed funding, from our perspective, should be to a good degree not state and government driven and grant driven. It should be angel community because it's smart money. Government can de-risk angels. Government can invest into what we call sidecar investments, act as an LP. But certainly the initiative in seed is a private one from our perspective. And the way how to structure that for us is funding policy. It's one example. Yeah, we always do it for pre-seed, seed, Series A, and onward scaling finance. Talent, again, availability of talent. We seek to analyze that. Experienced engineers, where are you? How are you competing? If you don't have enough in your ecosystem, most likely you will rush your products and services to market. And you will be less competitive. And then you get examples where global market reach in the end doesn't work because your startup entrepreneurs are developing something that's interesting locally, but it's not competitive globally because the resource simply wasn't there. That's all about education policy. That's all about qualification and mechanisms to very quickly qualify technical engineers. The same for growth employees, growth hacking skills. Are they available? Yes or no? If I don't have them, I can't tackle the international market. Again, what are the right elements? What are the right initiatives in order to build more growth hacking skills and growth talent in an ecosystem that's lacking those talents, as the client example that we are showing here, which just a very brief view. I was talking about the importance of the ambidextrous ecosystem, university, intellectual property, and commercialization through startups. we do an assessment. We use global patent analysis, but also a lot of funding data that show us trends in international trends and local developments in different technology subsectors. What we are trying to ascertain, to understand is, what's your local ecosystem potential? Where are you good at? Thomas is with us today. And Frankfurt is incredible in fintech and financial markets, I should say, not fintech and financial markets. That's the starting point of the discussion. Here in this example, it's life sciences, very strong locally. And then we try to understand how big is the potential globally, what's hot at the moment, what are trends that are really driving startup segments globally. For that ecosystem example, here it's not Frankfurt, we would say, okay, you are quite strong in blockchain, you got a high potential locally, skills, and it's also one of the hottest things on the startup planet Earth at the moment. So that's something to go for. It's a no-brainer. Then there are a few more nascent things, high global potential, but you're maybe not as high performant. AgTech, agricultural technology and new food. That would be what in Google's language, a moonshot. Do you want to bet on it? You're not very strong locally, but it's an incredibly important and high growth sector globally. Do you want to bet on it? Do you want to have one or two of these moonshots? In our analysis, we always try to find the right middle ground, bet on things you are strong. That's the foundation. That's the starting point. That's where you should start. Don't do everything. Bet on these 3 or 4 where you're locally really strong, but keep in mind what is growing very quickly globally and find the right mix here. That's what we try to develop in innovation. Get to an ecosystem that really works. Traditional innovation ecosystem, that's unis and R&D facilities and corporate innovation. And on the other hand side, the right connectors with the startup ecosystem. Slide deck, which Adam and I will be sharing later. In terms of learning from peers, I want to show you our network here at the moment. I was talking about policy failures and policy successes. That's the network that we host on a 4-weekly, 6-weekly basis in order to have these discussions in person, and in these days a lot of virtual work, in order to have this exchange, best practice ideas. If local connectedness doesn't work well, can I talk to somebody in the city of Amsterdam who've done an incredible job in building local community and local connectedness? Absolutely, because the person is sitting right in this forum. That's where we want to invite you to participate and take an active role in sharing and in learning from your peers. On peer learning, we seek to help defining action plans, because in the end, learning, assessment, that's all very nice. We need to get to action, and that's what we want to see. We want to execute or help execute it properly. Action for us often starts to rattle a cage with policymakers, really properly with governments, with defining a vision. We use data in order to showcase what would be possible. This is an ecosystem we are working with, not too far from where I'm sitting at the moment. That's the present day position. And we believe that they can, by 2025, reach a number 20 position in the world as an ecosystem. Is it really important? 19, 21? No, it's not, but it's a headline finding coming from a very small position to number 20 in the world, potentially, if they get it right. That's something that really excited policymakers. Yeah, really made them put their weight behind the story. And then we showed them a little bit of economic impact. What could happen if they are able to strengthen startup output, but also scale the scaling segment? What's the economic impact? What's the impact on job? But it really it rattles the cage. It really brings it home to policymakers, to leaders in government, what the potential of the startup ecosystem is and its incredible growth dynamics. Example, we proposed a 10% growth scenario, 10% growth per year, which is absolutely realistic. It's not easy, but it's realistic for that particular ecosystem. That would create 15,000 direct jobs by 2025, 4.5 years time period, and 57,000 in related servicing and supporting industries in the freelance community. Add them together, 75 or 74 in total, and that's an economic factor. These are the high quality jobs and well-paid jobs. So that's the beginning typically of defining a strategy by showing the objective, what can be achieved, what is possible, and then really going into the different factors. How do I achieve, how do I build towards this vision over 5 years? Building a stronger foundation, quality talent, elite acceleration, a focus on certain subsectors. I was talking about lab to startup performance, innovation edge. about looking at a deep tech funnel, because that's so important at the moment, and a combination of hardware and software and IoT and AMR and other examples, and again strengthening local community, that's local connectedness here. These were our proposals, so a really real life example. Then we went to say, well, if that has been achieved in 1 or 2 years, if we can achieve that, then we really need to look at building the top of the pyramid. Remember, there were no scaling businesses, or the distance to global average in my example was very poor. Then we can start with building global scaling mentorship, elite funding, and really create an elite scaling program that will deliver a scale-up segment that's mentionable by 2025. Quite ambitious, but not unrealistic, achievable. That's what we are trying to bring together in a roadmap, a development roadmap that defines action for the next 12 months, action for the next 2 years, actions for the next 5 years, and helps orchestrate that ecosystem. Last slide I want to show, because it's such an incredible success story. Here we show the rankings of ecosystems. We've been working with 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 5, one not. And this is how the ecosystems have gone up in our global ranking. And when you look at larger ecosystems, changing rank is not happening very much. Now have a look at what Stockholm has achieved, or where it's Toronto Waterloo, how they have come up as a fairly small ecosystem, but a highly developed ecosystem, how they have come up in the ranking and are now next to the top 20 in the world. Incredible success story. And Thomas, you will love this graph, I think. Where you started, we didn't rank you properly, at least not in the top 30 or top 20, for sure not. And look where Frankfurt, as a highly specialized ecosystem, has arrived today. And I think after my lengthy introduction, I hope you can tell us a little bit about the success story that we have seen in Frankfurt, and that's still ongoing and so exciting, and what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephan. Thank you also very much, Adam, for having me. This is really great to tell our story. But I think first of all, I have to also say it's really great the work that you do. Your growing community and the impact you actually have on the global startup ecosystem is really great, and we're still only a tiny part of it. And we started actually back in 2016, and I have to say that we to some extent were really lucky, because things were just coming together at the right place at the right timing. So actually, it was 3 streams where it started from. So there were 3 different parties that were separated from each other, but all of them had a huge interest in strengthening the local startup ecosystem, because they said Frankfurt has such a big potential, but there's not that much going on when it comes to innovations and startups. Why don't we do something about it? And the first stream was actually coming directly from the university. This is where I was located, my partner was located, so we were both teaching at the university entrepreneurship classes, and we always said it's somehow weird. In our region, we have 200,000 students, but they don't really have contact to the startup community. They don't really get exposed to the startup community. All they do is they start with the established corporations. They have a safe job, and that's also great. But why? Where's the young founders' potential? We always said, why don't we build a community? So that was our motivation for it. And then the second part of it, we have a strong, you said it also, a strong financial community, a strong established industry with many bigger corporations like Commerzbank, Deutsche Bank, Deutsche Börse, the European Central Bank is also located here. And if all of them said, we need to strengthen local ecosystems, and why don't we start in front of our doorsteps? And that was kind of the second stream, because fintech was also in their interest. They said the fintechs, well, they're going to replace our business model. Why don't we invite them to do that here? So that was an interesting mindset they had. And then the third part actually came from the policymakers. So the policymakers said, I've traveled around the world. So they made some different delegation visits. So they've been to London, visiting level 39, but they also been to the Valley. And they said, we need something like that here in Frankfurt as well to make the economy strive. And luckily, all of these 3 different streams came together at one bigger event where we actually celebrated the partnership of Frankfurt and Israel, the 50-year partnership. And we had 200 students there, and the minister was giving his welcome speech. And he actually said, I've just been to London, I've just visited level 39, and we need something like that. Why don't we do something about it? And interesting, we said we can do something about it. Let's fill a skyscraper with startups. That was quite ambitious at that time. Didn't fully work, but yeah, moonshots are always good. But then we said, well, why don't we start out with 2, 3, 4 levels at one certain spot and just bring together the community? And he said, that's a great idea. I'll support you. I'll write letters to the local industry, to the established industries, and say, hey, support these guys financially. And then we actually started building this community. We all of a sudden had a spot where we could actually rent our space. That's the one thing. So we started to rent out 3,500 square meters. We brought some startups, and interestingly, 8 established institutions, ING, Deutsche Bank, they supported us right away. And they said, here's the money, go for it. And we give you some years to actually develop the ecosystem. So the initial idea was really space. So really having a strength or really strong local community. And you talked about local connectedness is important. And this was really, really helpful. But we didn't stop there. We said space is not enough. So we started with talent activation programs. So right away, we actually invited, and that was interesting, invited talents from Israel and exchanged them with talents from our local universities. We brought them also to Tel Aviv. And they were actually building solutions for the established cooperations. And that was the first program we started, innovation program. Then we started acceleration programs. Deutsche Bank helped us also to bring a global acceleration player to Germany, which is Plug and Play. FinTech Europe actually landed in Frankfurt sometime later. So all of these different pieces, they somehow got together. And along the way, we'll talk about that right now. Of course, you supported us and you helped us as well. I just want to highlight one of the situations that was really great for us. So I think since we actually incorporated our organization, which is TechQuartier, we were wanting to be on the global map, but not just that, we also wanted to be assessed. We just wanted to see there needs to be a measurement. It's not enough just to do something and then hope it'll be good, but we wanted somebody to actually externally measure our achievements, and that's what you did. And I remember that we, after 1 year of work, we were really, really proud and happy because not just because you guys gave us good credits, you told us, well, there are certain improvements, but there's lots of things that you need to be doing, but still you're part of some of the different measurements and metrics you have, you're part of the top 50. And we were happy about that because we thought that Frankfurt is not even on the map. And then we presented that to our steering committee where all the bigger corporations, the policymakers are in there. And we told them, hey, look, this is great. Our first year of work really pays off, and Startup Genome assesses our work. There's a lot of things to do, but we were proud. But in the steering committee, actually, they told us that's not enough. You need to do more. So I'm sorry that we're not so happy. And well, of course, they congratulated us as well. But interestingly, from that discussion, which was sparked through your evaluation, we developed a master plan for the region. That was back in 2017. We said, okay, we can do more, but we need more funding. And we actually developed 4 different pillars where we said one of them is being the talent activation part. We need to strengthen the local connectedness. We need to bring more investors here, and we need to market the region. And based on that master plan, we were actually bringing together even more of those local industry players, stakeholders, policymakers that helped us to really fulfill this master plan. And this was just one of the examples where your work really did help us to improve the ecosystem. I'm really happy to see that the numbers are improving. I'm still sure that not on every level. So there's many things that we have to do, but we've grown in the past 4 years now to 40 corporates supporting us, not just 8, which were there at the beginning. We started out with 2 universities, even as a shareholder. So the 2 local universities are shareholders, Technical University, Darmstadt, Goethe. Now it's 7 universities. We started out with 0 startups in our community. Now it's more than 300 in our community. So this is really constantly growing, and this is what makes us really happy. And the 4th part of it, apart from, as I said, the established industries, the policymakers, and the startups, is now increasingly becoming important, is everything centered around talent activation. Because we have a huge potential here. It's not only that we build on the financial industries, we also build on 200,000 students, which are located in and around Frankfurt. So they're great universities, but as I said, all of them exposed to bigger corporations. And now we have a series of talent programs where we just activate them and bring them into the community because we need the future founders. That's a long-term shot. However, it's starting to pay off. So the first talent programs we started to run in 2017, 2016, and now they're coming back and starting to fund their businesses. And this is just in a nutshell what we do. You see that I could talk about that for at least half an hour more, but I think we should leave some room for conversation. I think you also have some questions, but that was just a quick introduction.
Thank you so much, Thomas. We're very fortunate to have you here today and to hear about the story of Frankfurt and how it's developed over the years, and as well our joint work together. I guess we'd love to hear a bit more about some of the biggest learnings you've had, I guess, working with our team in assessing and developing the ecosystem, and maybe a couple of examples of how data has helped drive conversations on policies or programs that are extremely needed within the ecosystem with different stakeholders.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that as I said, helped us, I just introduced, that was the general ranking and the general benchmarking, where it's about, because the Pope in their own house is not always the best to bring the message. So it was really helpful that you supported us there, and not just because you thought it's good, because you were actually fact-driven, number-driven. You'd identified the gaps and the opportunities. And then a second example is, I think, a very good one. We carried out a bigger study, the scale-up report on Frankfurt. So it's not only the general benchmarking we did, we also said, why don't we focus a little stronger on the companies that really have the potential to become big, the scale-ups, not only the early stage activities, but why don't we think about the scale-ups? And this report actually was really helpful to many different extents. But one example, and where there was really now a clear result, is one of the things you suggested to build on the strengths. And you said, well, what you have already is you have a strong fintech community, financial market community, cybersecurity is quite okay, and artificial intelligence. And you actually proposed and recommended to focus a little more on these technology streams, which was helpful because right now there's a policy initiative, lasts for 1.5 years now already, where it's about setting up a competence center for artificial intelligence, science-based. And that's 12 million of funding going exactly in that initiative. 20 new professors will be established at the universities, and we as TechQuartier play a major role because we want to translate all of the science results into the startup community. So that is not only about talent students starting, but actually the PhDs, the postdocs, and that new technologies which are being developed are not just scientifically of value, but also brought to the startup community and really applied in the technology community. And this is clearly where you had impact, because your study, the bigger one, suggested exactly that. You suggested that focus on certain streams of technology. That's just one more example that was really helpful.
And we briefly touched on before on the importance of benchmarking and comparing your ecosystems. In your work in developing the Frankfurt startup ecosystem, how important has this been to benchmark and compare your ecosystems either nationally or regionally or globally?
That's a very good question, because well, I should not be saying that, but I will say it. We always say we shouldn't compare ourselves too much with other ecosystems, because every ecosystem is unique, and it's really hard to say we're better than them. It really depends on the metrics. However, as there's a lot of value, because as you said, you can learn from the others, and you can really see what they've done good, and then see what fits for our ecosystem and what doesn't. And the second thing is that policymakers do work like that. Even though I personally say that I don't care where innovation comes from, where startups are located, I don't care. The most important thing, it has an impact. I'm not really focused on Frankfurt only. We started building our global community. So whether they are located in Africa, Asia, or the US, doesn't really matter to us, right? We want to apply and innovate. However, policymakers, they have a task to do, which is supporting the local ecosystem. So apart from really learning from other ecosystems, they of course look at where's Frankfurt located. Is it rank X, rank whatever, right? So this is kind of the two parts where it really helps.
And I guess delving deeper on a bit more on benchmarking and comparing, how important is it comparing over time? And I guess for your vision of the future for the Frankfurt startup ecosystem, and can you tell us a bit more about what you're looking towards for the future for Frankfurt and with your work?
Yeah, so we always say that we're still not doing good enough. I mean, as I said, some of the numbers are quite okay, but everybody else is also doing something, right? And we all need to do more. And it's the question of doing the right things. And we decided, as I said, quite early on to really heavily involve the universities, run talent programs. And we know that this is a long-term shot, but currently, just to give you some numbers, we have per year 200 to 300 students running through our programs, which is not a lot. However, it's okay, but we want to just really bring that number up to 1,000 to 3,000 students per year that are actually having a touch point with the university. If you look at the startups, as I said, we're supporting roughly 300 startups currently, and there is more room to support the startups. We as TechQuartier, I mean, there's more startups in the entire ecosystem, but I think these are the two things. Technology, as I said, artificial intelligence is the clear focus. But if you ask me, if you want to really spark innovation, entrepreneurship, and startups, you need to invest in the human capital, in the people. And there's no better way than tapping into the potential of the young students. Everybody can be a founder, but I think this is a huge potential in our ecosystem. 200,000 students, and we're just having a tiny bit, which is 200 per year, that we're really running through our programs. I think there's a lot of room for improvement for us.
And I guess a final question I would love to ask is, I guess, how important is utilizing data to align and convince different ecosystem stakeholders? I mean, public, private stakeholders, they each have their own agendas, their own points. How important is it bringing together all these different stakeholders, utilizing the data and research that you have?
There's only one answer. It is highly important because, as I said, that it's always easy to have qualitative arguments and to inspire with passion and tell them, hey, this is what we need to do, and this is what's important for the future, not just of Frankfurt, but for the future of the entire industry, the economy. But if you have numbers, if you have facts, if you have, as I said, benchmarks where you see this is what they do well, this is what they don't do well, this is where we're located, this is where we can improve. This is really, really important to have that, because otherwise your arguments are just qualitative and then you can inspire. But if you have the numbers and if you have good data, that always supports your arguments. And it's not just that, but it turns out to have a lot of new information which you didn't know. And this is where I think data is really important.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. And I guess we only have a few minutes left. So I guess on the next slide, we would like to move on to for the outro of our webinar today. But once again, thank you very, very much for providing your insights and your story at Frankfurt.
Can I just say one last thing? So
Definitely.
I'd really be happy for every other ecosystem builder just to, as Stephan also highlighted, I think it's not only about local connectedness, it's about global connectedness. And if there's anything that we as Frankfurt TechQuartier can do for you, just let us know, but also the other way around. We're really happy to contribute. I think it's about building that global community. And yeah, if there's anything that we can do or the other way around, then just let us know.
You know that I always do it. I think you stand out from a clear strategy, clear subsector focus, great thinking at the beginning. The connectedness with the university landscape, lab to startup performance, innovation edge, all these topics I was alluding to, but also the way how you orchestrate this roadmap since 16. It's really so succinct. It's really one element, one Lego brick is just fitting to the next one, and you can see the results. And you're such an example that we are always portraying because it's so fast in its development. We are all surprised. I've been living in Frankfurt in the early 2000s. I never could envisage a tech ecosystem of that magnitude, but also of that reputation to develop. I'm flabbergasted, and I think it's one of these examples. So thanks so much for sharing, because I bet a lot of others, I missed that argument, the way you've also build a connectivity with larger corporations and build an innovation center that also helps larger banks and larger companies to innovate and stay relevant and competitive. I think these are examples that are so important for many, many clusters around the world. So thanks for being open towards sharing, and I hope many of our members actually make use of that opportunity.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you once again, Thomas. So moving on to kind of next points that we would love to move on to is, so for any, I guess the key takeaway from today is that tech is still incredibly concentrated, and our goal is really to change this together globally. So we believe strongly in enabling your ecosystems all over the world in capturing a larger share of the global startup economy, especially in this very vital time that we're in at the moment. So we invite you to join our mission on startupgenome.com. This is our website. And on the next page, there are my details where you can please feel free to get in contact with myself to find out on any more information about our ecosystem assessment and strategy work that we conduct globally. And as well to, I would like to invite you to our next series of webinars on September the 9th, where we will have the topic of how we support the global startup revolution. So we'll have the exact same timing to accommodate for all time zones in 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. London time and San Francisco time. And I would like to thank everyone for joining today, and especially thank you again to Thomas and to Stephan.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Have a fantastic week.